For all of you, perfect. There's our recording that you're going to get. For all of you that I haven't had the pleasure of meeting yet, I'm Kyra Richards. I lead creative strategy here at Motion, and I get to hang out with all of our amazing clients all the time to talk all things creative strategy and how to get the most out of Motion. I come from a background of all things paid media. I've been on the agency side, brand side. I've worked at Meta as well. So I've had a really fortunate opportunity to get to see how so many different brands and agencies set up their different creative strategies, their reporting cadences, and all things in paid media. So I'm excited to share some of that with you guys today, specifically focused on how we can actually structure our naming to get the most out of Motion. So on the agenda for today, we're going to start with talking about how naming actually fits into creative analysis. Then we'll get into the meat of it, of what you should actually include. I know this is why most of you are here today. And then we'll round it out with some tips and tricks as you're going to implement this. And I'm going to save a good chunk of time at the end for Q&A. I know you guys are good question askers, so drop it all in the chat. Carissa is going to be here to help me with this. She'll be taking all of your chat messages. We'll consolidate those in and host a nice Q&A session at the end. So drop them as we go, and then we'll finish that off at the end with our Q&A. All right, let's dive in. So when we think about the role that naming plays, it all really comes back to this creative analysis phase. So if you've been to any of the Motion events, you have probably seen our creative strategy flywheel here. So whenever we're going and we're creating content, we always follow some similar path to this of going through all of the motions that we need to do to continually fulfill this cycle so that we can continue to make better creative. And creative analysis is the final step in this process. And the goal when we get to creative analysis is really just to figure out what were all the learnings from the last cycle that we went through so that we can actually do it better when we go into this next cycle. And naming is actually what allows us to track all of those attributes or decisions that we made that led to the asset that we created in a way where we can actually structure data around it. And so that's what's really going to allow us to generate those super actionable and clear insights that we can share with our clients, our cross-functional teams, our executive teams, everybody that's eager to learn about what happened. So for example, if we had run a promotion and at the end of it, we wanted to understand for the different offers we had run during the promotion, which one had worked better, as long as we tracked that offer type in our ad name, we would be able to easily group any ad that was focused on buy one, get one versus any ad that was focused on 50% off so that we can get a super clean visual on what actually happened and start to pull out trends based on that offer type. We could also do something similar with influencer name. So if we track that influencer name of what influencer was in our ads, or if maybe there wasn't an influencer, we could track that too. And then we can get this really nice, clear view into how the promotion actually performed across the different influencers that we're working with. Super helpful for informing maybe what influencers we work with next time we're on a promotion. Or if we see some trends in between the ones that were our top influencers, maybe we start to look a little bit closer at those and say, hey, let's go find some other influencers that are similar to the people that are working really well for us. So it allows us to really take all of this data that we have with all these ads and start to group it together in really meaningful ways. And so how it actually looks when you start to get into Motion is that we're just going to go in and set up a comparative report. So a lot of the reports we work with are top performing, where you're going to be working on more of that individual ad basis, but comparative reports are what is going to let you group things together. So here we can see that we had over 300 ads that we were running in this sprint, and half of those we were calling BOGO and half of them we had 50% off. So because we capture that in the ad name, we can now segment those different ads into groups to where we can compare the metrics that are attached to them. So if we wouldn't have named anything in this, we would have had 300 something ads sitting in front of us where maybe we could look at some of the top spenders and get directional insights in what happened, but it would be so hard to actually get it to where we could really consolidate what was 50% off, what was BOGO for the clear insight that we wanted. But with this, it's really easy to group them apart. And now we get the beautiful chart that we can start to surface and share with other people we're working with. The other place where naming is going to come in, though, is that we can also filter reports with naming. And this is going to come into play across comparative reports, but also those top performing reports that you're working with as well. So say that we just wanted to understand in this specific instance, which promo or which offer worked better for just our prospecting audience, or maybe that's top of funnel for some of you in your nomenclature, but the people that don't really know us as well yet. We might want to look at them separate from the people that have already been to our site or maybe purchased from us previously, because we're going to have very different behaviors. And so maybe there's even deeper segments of trends that we can start to pull out. So you'll be able to use your naming in these different ways to really curate your reports. And it becomes really powerful once we start to get some of these tracked in the naming. But the question then becomes, what do we actually put in our naming? And so this is where we're going to spend a bulk of our time today talking about some of the things that we can include. So when we're thinking about naming, naming can live at all different levels in ad accounts. So we can have campaign naming, we can have ad naming, everywhere in between. These are a lot of the foundational elements that most of you are probably already tracking in your ad name today. So this is just a core set that we want to get going. It helps us identify what's going on in the account. We've got a couple things in here like stage of funnel at the campaign level that's going to help us to kind of segment what's going on. We can see some things like maybe asset type of images versus videos. How are those different things performing? But beyond this, we want to be able to layer in additional elements that are going to help us learn. Because at the end of the day, if naming is really there to produce that beautiful report at the end, if we can figure out what we want to learn and have an idea of what report we want to build at the end of this, it's going to allow us to back into naming in a way where we can actually make sure everyone is getting serviced by this report in the right way to inform the decisions that they're making whenever they're going through the next creative cycle. And I say everyone here on purpose because a lot of times naming gets stuck with maybe media buyers, or it's very specific to the editor that was putting the final touches on an asset to put in naming and kind of dictate what's going to be included. But there's so many other people that are involved in the process. So I love to get, our talent managers, so people that are going and sourcing influencers and creators. I love our production teams that are helping to figure out who are we casting. Super important to have briefing teams involved of how are they briefing, maybe even our brand teams if we're working with them, of how are they thinking about bringing this to life? What things are they questioning? Because when you start to pull all these different brains and perspectives together, you start to get really interesting ideas of elements that we might want to track that will help to inform what people are doing. And the big thing to remember as we start going through this exercise of doing brainstorms and coming up with ideas that we want to track, so we always need to keep that end report in mind. And the most important piece of this is really staying clear on what are you going to be grouping together to compare? So keep that in the back of your mind as we start to go through some of these exercises that we can start to host across the different elements that are going to tie in. So when we think about the different learnings that we actually want to brainstorm against, they typically fall into about 3 buckets. The first is going to be attributes. This is probably going to feel most familiar to you guys because it's going to be all of the characteristics that are happening in an ad. But these are usually characteristics that are going to apply to a really large set of our ads. So it's going to be an ongoing thing. This is something we can have in our naming and apply to ads that will launch throughout at least a quarter, hopefully a year. But the longer we can track these attributes, the more that we're going to be able to really get a clearer read on what are the trends over time and make sure we have enough different assets in there to where we can really say, hey, we feel really good about taking this learning and running with it. So these are going to be things like maybe what gender of talent was included in the video. You might do something like copy length if we're trying to bust some hypotheses of short versus long. The next bucket, though, is processes. And this is probably one that I get most excited about that we don't typically include as often, but can be so incredibly powerful. And so when I think about processes, I think about what were all of those little micro decisions and steps that we took throughout that creative strategy flywheel to make this ad. And do we have different versions of those floating around? So a really good example of this is briefing. Do we have different ways that we're briefing campaigns, or even if we're working with like creators, do we have different types of briefs that we're using? Maybe one brief is like super in-depth. It gives all the brand guidelines, is 5 pages long, gives super specific talking points that they need to hit on, gives them really a lot that's very structured and informative, versus maybe we have more casual briefs that leave it a little bit more open-ended for creators. If we're working in those two different types of ways, if we can start to track that of when the asset was created, what brief actually informed that asset, then over time, we can start to actually get data to inform, hey, which briefing process should we actually use when it comes to briefing our creators? So if we can start to identify what these processes are, it becomes super powerful of aligning our resources behind the ones that are actually going to generate the most winners. The last bucket is going to be our tests. So the first 2 buckets are things that we'll track over a long period of time and should apply to a lot of assets. Tests are a little bit different though. Tests are things that I will tag at the end of my ad naming convention, and they're going to be pretty specific and usually short term. So a lot of times these are going to be things that are tied to like a specific campaign that is launching, or if we get a batch of assets that we're about to launch and we look at them and we're like, ooh, we noticed this one element that's different. Maybe it's like a very specific like text overlay difference in the hook. And we want to make sure that like we think that will be impactful to performance. We want to make sure and tag that so that we can have the clear learning on it when we come out on the other side. So what I want to do is dive into each of these buckets and give you guys some exercises that you can start to do with your teams, or if you're on the agency side, your clients, and even pulling in their teams to get everyone kind of thinking about what are the most impactful things to include. So for attributes, I have 3 different exercises that I like to take teams through. Typically, I'll lean into maybe 1 or 2. I don't typically do all 3 at once. So kind of pick the one that you think will resonate most with the people you're working with, and lean in there. So the first way we can start to approach this is just looking at top and bottom performers. So if we pull those over the last couple of months, we put them up on the screen. We don't even need to put metrics. Doesn't even matter if we just have a bucket of top performers, a bucket of bottom performers, and let people start looking at the assets and ask them to see what they notice. And if there's anything they can pull out of maybe why they think top performers were top performers and bottom performers were bottom performers. When you take metrics out of the equation and you just get people thinking about it from all the different aspects and stages of the funnel, they'll usually start to notice some pretty interesting things or have different hypotheses. And that can lead you to really pulling out what are maybe those specific elements that are meaningful to the decisions they're making and they're part of the process that we can really bring to life and help inform with a little bit of data. And that's where we can pull that into ad naming and start to track those specific elements so people can learn. The next one is if maybe we don't have time to pull all of the top and bottom performers, it gets messy, it's going to get questions, totally fine. Let's just reflect on the last creative cycle. So when we're thinking about how we just made assets, I love to dive into 2 specific areas here. One, was there any feedback that was debated? Feedback rounds on assets can always be a little bit crazy. And so when we're thinking about feedback, if there are ones where we're arguing with gut feel, we don't really have a good read on like why we should make this decision or what we should include and what we shouldn't, that's a great opportunity to include that in your naming so that we can get some clear data to support the decisions that we're making. We can also do kind of like a word cloud exercise. So if you have to think about the last creative cycle that you were in, and you had to make a word cloud in your mind, like what themes and topics would pop up into it? And you'll be surprised as you start to take a step back of like what things you were constantly being asked or telling other people. Those are typically the areas that we're going to want to figure out how to align some data behind, because it's areas that people are really interested in and kind of need that data to help make decisions. And then the last one, this one can be really effective for more of our creative team members, is like, what are the different aspects that you would iterate on potentially in this asset? So without even knowing what data comes back, we can get people to start thinking about the decisions that they made. And these are usually a little bit smaller, but can be really helpful. So for instance, it might be something like, should we include a full text overlay of the whole hook in that first frame? Or do we have it slide in across the first 2 seconds of the asset? And so you might notice that they were having to make those decisions within the design process, but they didn't even realize sometimes that they were until you ask them what they would change or what they would iterate on. And this can help set you up to really understand if there are differences when we're thinking about these, of like, where we want to go and like how we'll get the data back to inform it, right? Because we can always assign metrics to like 1 or 2 ads and understand what iterations we want to make. But if we're specifically tracking having that text overlay in the first second versus having it slide in the first couple of seconds, then that's going to help us to maybe get an insight about that specific element and a creative learning that we can kind of build upon and work with. So as we move into more processes, this is where you might have to pull it out of people a little bit more because it's a little bit different of a way of thinking. But here we just really want each person to think about where they fit in the creative cycle. So what decisions are they responsible for? This will be different for every single role. And so if they start to think about what decisions they are really making and what data would be helpful to inform those, that's a really, really great area for us to start diving in and really think about what strong learnings we can pull out. We can also think about templates. If we have any templates that we're using, this is usually a signal to me of I'm like, okay, let's double click into that template. Why do we use this template? Are there different versions we could be using? Let's think about how we can start to track this of when we're using one version versus another. We can also think about frameworks or what goals we're setting to drive decisions we make too. These are really great opportunities to kind of surface. So on the framework side, maybe we're using some copy frameworks or maybe some frameworks for how we structure our video ads of what information we put in the beginning, what information goes at the end. We can start to track some of these and say, hey, if we use this framework versus another, how does that change the performance of our ads? So these are some good exercises you can start to run through with your teams to come up with what some of those elements might be that you want to start including in your ad name. What I will say though, is this does not need to be a boil the ocean exercise. You don't want like a forever long ad name that has so many different like elements in it that you're having to build 5,000 reports. Hone in on what the ones that are going to be the most impactful are going to be. So which ones are you actually going to be able to take action from and which ones are really going to help your team members? Typically, I say, let's give like each person that's working through this with us, maybe 2 to 3 elements, really 1 to 2 that we're tracking. We can add more elements in over time. We can remove others as we get learning. So this is not set in stone. You don't have to do it perfectly the first time. So the test elements are a little bit different though. So test elements, we're going to do less brainstorming on, and more so we're going to assess these as we're going through the creative process. And there's 2 key stages where we assess these. The first is going to be the briefing phase. So when we're briefing in assets, we always want to think to ourselves, is there a learning that we're wanting to derive from this set of assets that we're launching? If so, do we have the right variety of assets that we're asking for in content creation? So if we go back to that promotion example from the beginning, if we hadn't had the variety of 50% off and buy one, get one, we're not going to be able to see how different offers work because maybe we would have only leaned into one offer. So we have to make sure that that is actually getting put in to the process so that we can make sure we're getting the right creative and content that we're actually going to put in to be able to track and get those learnings. The other place is going to be the evaluation phase. So after content has been made, when we're going through, we're going to kind of getting to the final feedback rounds. This is a great place to just take a quick pause, look at all of the assets that you're about to launch in this set and say, what do you notice? Why do you think, like, which ones do you think are going to win? Which one do you think are going to lose? And what do you notice about those assets? Is there anything that we want to track so that we have some better reports to kind of talk about why we think assets performed and kind of hone in on different metrics? So these are the two places where you can start to lean in and take a quick pause to just think about what are the things that we're tracking. And it's going to make your life so much easier in the creative analysis phase, because then you're not going to have to figure all of that out of what questions should I answer? Okay, what learnings can I find? I have to dig through all of this endless data and come up with a story. It's going to make it so much easier if you kind of go in already thinking about some of the things that you want to learn. So as we go through these exercises and we identify the elements that we want, really now it's just our job of figuring out how we translate those over into the naming convention. And so this is where, again, it's really important to keep that end report in mind, because we have to really understand what different things do we want to be able to compare. So this is meaningful data. If we get too granular in what we're tracking, you're going to have a million different columns, and it's probably not going to tell the clean story that you want. So anytime you're thinking about what is the descriptor for this element that I'm going to include in my naming convention, make sure that that is a column that you want in your report. So once we have elements, let's talk a little bit about these tips and tricks for actually getting it implemented. So like I said, we're going to have to get that naming generator built. And so this needs to be a shared resource between everybody on your team, because consistency is going to be the hardest thing and the most important thing once we're getting this in the naming generator. If one person is naming images with IMG and the other person is naming images writing out the full word, you're going to have to now add multiple filters anytime you're trying to group those together. So it's not impossible. So if something goes wrong, no sweat, it's just a little bit more manual work. But as much as we can, we want to keep everything super consistent so that it makes reporting at the end a breeze. Once the naming generator is built, that's when we can actually define the clear owners of who's going to be working on these processes. So we're going to have people that are going to own naming assets, and then we're going to need someone that can actually manage the sheet and the elements and the descriptors. So when it comes to naming assets, this might be one person, it might be a couple of different people. We just need to make sure that everyone is really trained up on how to use the sheet, when to think about what descriptor to attach, make sure they understand what learning we're wanting to try and get out of the naming so that we can label things in the right way. And then the person that manages the sheet, where it's really going to be important for them to be at play is if that person that's naming assets is like, hey, there's not really a good choice for this asset. I want to include a new descriptor for this one. That's when this person's going to have to take a step back and say, okay, like, does this make sense to actually add in? Is it too granular? And how do we want to handle that? For the most part, you shouldn't be making a lot of changes to your naming conventions and the descriptors you're tracking after you've set them up. Typically, we want to follow a pretty structured process of the key themes that are going to apply across most of your ads. And we'll walk through a full template of what this looks like in just a second to give you a little bit more visual on what we can think about when it comes to naming generators. So once we have that, we'll generate the names, and then you can start launching your ads. And then it becomes the fun part of just getting all of the different reports built so we can start to pull insights. So this should be fairly quick once we actually have everything solidified of what we want to track. You'll just go in, and typically what I'll do is create comparative reports for each of the elements that we're tracking in the ad naming. And that way, as new ads are launched with that, we'll just have data start populating in those reports over time. So you can go in and check, and then you can get all of the insights that you were looking for. So before we go into Q&A, I want to go through a quick template that we're going to share with you guys after the call. And there's going to be a full log of all of the examples that I know you guys are excited and hungry for. So let's jump over there for a second and we'll dive in. So this sheet, you can come in, you will get view access. So just do that file, make a copy, and then you'll be set up to change it and use it as you please. There's instructions here in case you ever forget which phase you're in or where to go to next. But basically, we'll follow these tabs all the way through the process. So here's a good resource you can use for your element brainstorm with different teams. So sometimes I'll even just give access during the brainstorm. Everyone can go and like brain dump all of the different things that they want to learn or elements they want to track. And then we can all talk through it together to actually associate, like, what is that element that we would want and what are the descriptors that we would use. So everyone's really aligned on kind of what report's going to come out of it at the end. If during the brainstorm, you start to get stuck, sometimes it can be a little slow or hard in the beginning, you can come over to the element inspiration. And for those of you that have seen this template before, this is new. So you can go here and peruse it. We've been dropping a ton of different things that I've seen people track that I'm really excited about that I think work well. And you'll have this at your fingertips. So we have some fun things like iteration version. This will help us understand, like, on average, like, how many iterations does it take us from an original ad to generate winners? Or do we ever generate winners after iterating? So this can really help to define, like, how much resourcing should we really put behind iterations versus the new concepts that we talk about. We can also track things like what product we featured. This is really great. So beyond reporting, this has like another use case of if you have a lot of products that are constantly going out of stock and you need to make sure you're pulling down any ads that have that product present. Naming is going to make it really easy to do that too. So while we're talking about naming through the lens of reporting and analysis today, there's so many other benefits to really having a strong naming convention and making sure you're tracking the things that are meaningful for your business. So any problems where we're having to go and turn off or get things like that, we can always turn to name and be like, hey, is that something that I can track in my naming to make it a little bit easier or to get some cleaner data on it? So this can be a good one to peruse. But once we have that element brainstorm done, then we're just going to throw it into this naming glossary lookup. So the way the back half of this sheet functions is we have a name generator tab right here. These two tabs are actually connected to each other. So anything in the naming glossary is going to carry over to the naming generator so that people can come in, and each line item is going to be one ad that they're filling out each element and descriptor for, so that we can say, okay, ad 1 is a video. The asset length is 1 to 3 seconds. Now, these two are unique. And I think it's important to have at least one, maybe two unique-ish descriptors, because we want to be able to understand what was the actual creative we were running in this. So sometimes this is going to be a creative ID. Sometimes this will just be your description of the asset that you're running. And same thing with copy, right? It helps us to have an idea of what copy was running, what creative was running. This is really helpful too for media buyers when they're in the accounts, just to kind of know what's happening. The rest of these will just be tied to that other sheet of concept, and then you can select the different elements that you want. So we can go all the way through. Once we've gone through, what will happen is it's going to spit out an actual ad name that can be trafficked in the ad account from here. So this one will use the naming separator. So see this underscore here, you can change that to mimic whatever naming convention you have used in the past. Sometimes we'll even append this to maybe a naming convention media teams have already solidified. So if we wanted to change this to a dash, I just update it there, and now we have dashes. So feel free to edit this once you make a copy into whatever you see fit. So once we do this and you have updated all of these of the different elements and descriptors that you want to fill in, like for example, you would change this example concept 1 to whatever concept that you're working with is, then you'll have those really clean drop downs. And this is going to prevent anybody from spelling image in different ways or accidentally like misspelling something and it breaking. Makes it really easy having that drop down for the consistency. One element I do want to specifically call out is asset length. So in Motion specifically, we love to use a lot of video view type metrics of, did people make it 50% of the way through the asset? Did they make it to the 15-second mark? And because we use so many of those metrics, it can be so incredibly helpful to have asset length just from a filtering capacity. So this is less about comparing and more about filtering so that we can get clear metrics and really understand how video consumption changes between these different asset types. So this is one I highly, highly, highly recommend pulling in for almost everybody. As long as you're running video, I would add this to your ads. It's really going to help you to curate those motion reports specifically more to your business. Other than that, though, figure out what are going to be meaningful metrics that you can actually act upon. And those are the ones that I would start to include. So that is all of the content that I have for you guys today. So with that, Carissa, if you would like to rejoin me, we can do some Q&A from the chat.
Yeah, awesome. Thanks, Kyra. I just feel like naming is so important, whether you're like a smaller company or a bigger one, just having those structures in place are going to be so helpful for grabbing that insight. So super helpful. We actually did have quite a few questions too, and some that sort of tied together. So I'm going to sort of summarize and bundle them. First one, Kyra, and I know you did cover this one a little bit when we were talking about who is in charge of sort of naming and the generator, but there was a few that came in. So I'd love to just go into that a little bit deeper. Like if, you have all these different teammates, like you said, all these different pieces of the puzzle, all these different teams that want to track different elements, who really should be the one that's in charge of naming the assets if you had to pick? And then along with that, managing the generator, should it be the same different person? Just a little bit more detail about that would be great.
Yeah, 100%. This can get tricky and it can look very different in different organizations depending on how you're set up. The way I see it play out the most is typically it will either be like someone that's close to the end of the process. So like our final editors of the creative or the media buyers that are kind of filling out that ad name generator. But what's really important, and this is why I like to have those big like cross-functional and team-wide sessions of brainstorming, is that if we have clear alignment in the front half of this process of what each team member wants to learn, it should be pretty straightforward to make sure whoever is filling out and labeling each creative, that they're labeling it in the right way. If there is uncertainty about what descriptor should be applied to a specific ad or what tag should be applied to the specific ad, then that's where we haven't done the good job of actually showcasing and understanding what learning do we want to get out of this and how is it going to impact our other team members. So we should be able to service a lot of different people, get them the insights they want without having them to actually come in and label the assets themselves, as long as we talk about it. So I would just figure out whatever person has the bandwidth to be able to add this in as a piece of the puzzle. I would also include a like check mark box, honestly, of when something is ready for the next person, if it's not the media buyer that's doing ad naming. So if we're passing naming from a creative team to the media team, let's just have that checkbox. It can make it easier for them to know when ads are fully generated and when they're not. And then after an ad has been launched or passed off, I'll usually just hide that row in the sheet so that you can keep working off of the same sheet as you're going.
Awesome.
Second half of that question, really quick. Sorry, Chris, I know I have a lot. But the second half is the person that manages those descriptors. The person that manages this should be the person that is most involved in like actually pulling together the learnings and communicating those to others, because the key with that is if we start to get requests for really wonky or granular descriptors, they're the ones that are going to have to be able to look at that and say, will that actually make sense in the analysis that we're working with? And will that enable the person that's going to use that report to make the right decisions? So if you are having someone that is a little bit more removed from the analysis, be the person that owns that sheet from like an operations standpoint, make sure they're checking in with the stakeholder that's going to be impacted by the report that these names are going to be generating. And that should keep you kind of whole on making sure that we don't get really chaotic in the sheet with a bunch of random things that then make the analysis hard at the end.
Awesome. Yeah. It just sounds like you definitely need somebody in charge of it, either like two pieces of the pie of one and the other or one together, just to make sure that everything makes sense, and that we're not adding in sort of elements that the other teams don't understand. Awesome. And then a question too about naming. I know you had mentioned once you get that structure in, it's kind of important to keep that consistent, just to make sure like you have older ads and newer ads, which are still following that same kind of flow. But in terms of when to start reevaluating the different elements to include in naming, what do you recommend in terms of that? Is it something you do on like a yearly basis or like every few weeks or every time you launch a new campaign? What do you suggest when it comes to that?
Yeah, it's a great question. So because we have that like those test elements that we can always tack on to the end, I typically use those on a more like campaign basis. And then I would say it kind of depends on the pace of your business and the hunger for learnings of how often you're going to reevaluate this and how many you're going to include. Quarterly is usually a good time to just kind of check in and look at it. And then it might be once every half that you're really adding in new elements, just depending on how quickly we're learning, how fast we're moving. So somewhere between that quarterly and like once a half mark is typically pretty good for just doing a quick check-in and making sure all teams are serviced and there's not any like new things that have come up or processes that have changed that we want to roll into the naming conventions.
Okay, cool. Yeah, love that. That makes sense. Two more questions when just looking through the chat. Just wanted to throw this one in here really quick. We had a question about including these elements in the ad name itself and whether or not you should include it in the ad set and campaign name too. I'm thinking as long as it's in the ad name, you're good. Like you don't need to pull campaign and ad set into that as well, but just in terms of where these live, just any thoughts around that?
Yep. So most of the elements we talked today are specific to ads. And so you're going to want to label them at the ad level. So for example, if we were labeling talent name, you could have an ad set that has ads with multiple talent in them. So like you might have one ad that has Carissa and you might have one ad that has me. And so that would get tricky to label that at the ad set level. So typically I like to try and identify what I would want to track at each level and then adjust the naming to those. We focused more on ad today. There are elements within campaigns and ad sets that are important to track too, though. These typically follow a little bit more on like the media buying side of maybe different structures that we're running in the ad account, bid types that would live at the ad set level. My first rule of thumb, though, for naming at campaign and ad set level is you should definitely have some type of descriptor that gives you an idea of why you're breaking things out. So if we have 4 different campaigns, why did we make the choice to split those campaigns in 4? Make sure that you're able to easily label that in your naming. And typically that will help you pull the reports that you're looking for at the end, because those are going to be really helpful for that filtering, maybe less so comparing groups, but those filters are going to be really helpful in kind of making sure you get to the right segment of your ad account.
Okay, awesome. And then last question I had here, from an agency perspective, say you're working with multiple different clients and maybe for your own sake, you want to have that consistency among one client to the next. What do you recommend in terms of ad naming and these templates just to help with that consistency, but making sure you're also getting that impactful learning among the different types of clients you might have?
Yes, this is tricky on the agency side because we want to service our clients, but we also want to get insights within our agency and make sure as team members are switching teams that it's really easy for them to ramp up. Typically, what I will do is I will figure out what are those core elements that we're tracking across majority of our clients that everyone will benefit from learning. I will stack those at the front of my ad name. So at least the first half of the ad name, maybe 3/4, is consistent across most of your clients. Then you might have 3 or 4 elements that you're tracking that are that specific to that client you're working with. So those will be very specific to the client. And then at the very end, you'll still be able to tack on more of your testing elements. So basically, I will pull any element that I'm going to use for the longest time or the most consistently towards the front of the name, and anything that's going to be shortest term or just using it on a one-off basis towards the back half of the name. That way you'll have some consistency when we're pulling big reports, or if you're even trying to download things like across different ad accounts, you can start to see some of those trends fairly easily.
Awesome. I love it. I think that's all the questions we had. I'm prompting if anyone else has questions, throw them in the chat and we can cover it. But I think you definitely covered all the bases there, Kyra. So I super appreciate it going over all that.
Awesome. Well, thanks for the questions, everyone. We are super excited to have our first customer event in the books. So because this is a first, please give us all of the feedback in the survey. Tell us what was helpful. Tell us what wasn't. Tell us what you want to come next. Like, we're really hungry to do more of these events, and I want to make sure that they are actually helpful for you guys. So give us that feedback, and we're really excited to do more of these with you. Also, check out the Dara Denny the series that is coming up. It's going to be so good. So much content dropping out of that. So that's going to be our next kind of content series that is dropping for everybody. Get in line, get registered for that one, get insights. It's going to be great. But I really appreciate all of you taking the time to join today and for just being a part of the Motion community. And I'm excited to see y'all soon. Have a good one, everyone. Thanks for coming.
Bye, everyone.